I bought my dream home to escape. Then Mom ordered, "Pack your things. We're moving in tomorrow and taking over. It's ours now." Instead of crying, my analytical brain kicked in. I set a devastating trap. My name is Natalie. I am 29 years old, and for the past 12 years, my official title on paper was Senior Risk Analyst for a corporate litigation firm. But if you asked me what my actual, full-time job was, the answer would be much darker. My real job was being a human ATM for my parents. For as long as I can remember, my life was defined by the humming of fluorescent office lights and the crushing weight of exhaustion. I worked 80-hour weeks. I survived on cold vending machine coffee, stale turkey sandwiches eaten at 2 in the morning, and pure, unfiltered adrenaline. I didn't have hobbies. I didn't date. I didn't even sleep a full 8 hours. I just worked. I stared at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred into solid gray lines, analyzing financial risks for massive corporations, finding their vulnerabilities, and plugging their leaks. It was highly paid, highly stressful, and it slowly drained the life out of my bones. But the money I made never really felt like mine. It felt like a resource that was constantly being tapped by an outside force. That force was my mother, Diane. Diane was a woman who believed that bringing a child into the world was not an act of love, but a long-term financial investment. She viewed my success not as something to be proud of, but as a dividend she was owed. And my father, Walter? He was the silent enabler. He was a man who spent his entire life looking at his shoes, avoiding conflict at all costs, and quietly letting Diane run roughshod over everyone in her path. Whenever my phone lit up with Diane's name, my chest would tighten. It was never a call to ask how my day was, or if my chronic migraines were getting any better. It was always an emergency. A few $100s here because the water bill was magically 3 months past due. $1,000 there because Walter's car needed a new transmission, even though the car rarely left the driveway. I paid it all. I paid it because I was conditioned from birth to believe that a good daughter fixes things. I was carrying a deeply ingrained, toxic guilt that told me if I just gave them enough, if I just proved my worth through my bank account, they would finally look at me with genuine affection. I thought I was buying a family. I didn't realize I was just paying a subscription fee for people who didn't actually like me. The stress manifested physically. I had panic attacks in the pristine, marble bathrooms of my office building. I would lock myself in a stall, clutching my chest, trying to remember how to pull air into my lungs. My doctor told me my blood pressure was that of a woman twice my age. He told me I needed to slow down, to find peace, or my heart was going to give out before I hit 30. But I couldn't stop. Because stopping meant I wouldn't have the funds for the next family crisis, and if I didn't have the funds, I would be labeled the selfish, ungrateful daughter who abandoned her parents after everything they did for her. That was the narrative Diane pushed. That was the invisible leash around my neck. To truly understand how deep this conditioning went, you have to go back to when I was 18 years old. I was a straight-A student, desperate to get out of our cramped, tense suburban house. I had been accepted into a great university. For years, Diane and Walter had proudly told our neighbors and relatives that they had a college fund ready for me. They promised to cover my tuition. They told me to focus entirely on my grades and not to worry about working a minimum wage job during high school. I trusted them implicitly. Why wouldn't I? They were my parents. 1 week before my freshman semester was set to begin, the tuition bill was due. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, pushing the printed invoice toward Walter. He didn't look up from his newspaper. Diane walked into the room, poured herself a cup of coffee, and dropped a bomb that shattered my entire reality. She sighed, a dramatic, breathy sound she used whenever she was about to play the victim. "Natalie, sweetie," she said, not making eye contact. "We had a long talk. Your father has worked so hard his whole life. We decided we need to enjoy our golden years while we still have our health. So, we used the fund." I stared at her, my mind completely blank. "Used it for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. Diane smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We bought a luxury recreational vehicle. A beautiful motorhome. We are going to travel the country. You are a smart girl, Natalie. You can take out some student loans. It builds character. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Walter, silently begging him to say it was a bad joke. He just turned the page of his newspaper and mumbled, "Your mother is right, kiddo. We deserve this." They had taken $50,000, money they swore was for my education, and bought a rolling living room with leather seats. I was left scrambling. I spent the next 4 years working double shifts at a greasy diner off campus, smelling like stale fryer oil during my morning lectures. I took out brutal, high-interest loans just to keep a roof over my head and buy textbooks. I was exhausted, bitter, and drowning in debt before my adult life even began. And the worst part? Diane completely flipped the script. When I cried about the stress of working 30 hours a week on top of a full course load, she told all our relatives that I was acting like a spoiled brat. She gaslighted me so thoroughly that I actually started to believe I was the villain for ruining the celebration of their new motorhome. I learned a devastating lesson that week. My parents' desires would always eclipse my basic needs. But instead of walking away, that twisted guilt kept me tethered to them. I spent the next decade trying to prove I wasn't the selfish monster Diane told everyone I was. The ultimate breaking point of my empathy, the moment the illusion truly began to crack, happened when I was 24. I was 2 years into my corporate job, barely making a dent in my massive student loan debt, living in a tiny studio apartment where the heater sounded like a dying lawnmower. It was a Tuesday afternoon. My phone rang, and Diane's name flashed on the screen. The moment I answered, she was hysterical. She was sobbing so hard I could barely make out the words. "It's your dad," she wailed into the receiver. "He needs emergency gallbladder surgery, Natalie. He's in so much pain. The doctors say it has to happen right now, but our insurance has a massive deductible. We don't have the money. They are going to send him home to suffer." I could hear Walter in the background, letting out weak groans. Panic seized my chest. This wasn't a broken transmission or a late water bill. This was my father's life. My mind went into overdrive. I didn't stop to ask to speak to a doctor. I didn't ask for a copy of the medical bill. I was in full rescue mode. Diane said they needed $24,000 immediately to cover the deductible and the out-of-network surgeon fees. I drained the meager $3,000 I had managed to save. Then, I spent my lunch break applying for an unsecured personal loan with a terrifying interest rate. By the end of the day, I had wired $24,000 directly into Diane's checking account. I spent the next 3 days practically vibrating with anxiety, waiting for updates. Diane texted brief messages saying Walter was recovering, but it was a tough process and they needed privacy. 3 months later, I managed to get a long weekend off work. I drove 6 hours to their house for a surprise visit, bringing a basket of expensive soft foods and teas for Walter's recovery. When I walked through the front door, the first thing I noticed was that Walter looked incredibly healthy. He was sunburned, in fact. He was sitting on the couch, drinking a beer and eating spicy chili, 2 things you absolutely do not consume shortly after major gallbladder surgery. I asked him how his incisions were healing. He looked at me with total confusion. "Incisions?" he asked. Diane quickly stepped into the room, her face pale for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a tight smile. But I had already seen enough. I walked past her, straight into her bedroom. I don't know what I was looking for, maybe a hospital bracelet, maybe some prescription bottles. Instead, sitting on her pristine duvet cover, was a brand new, limited edition designer handbag. I recognized the logo instantly. It cost exactly $6,000. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled open her bedside drawer. Sitting right on top was a thick stack of glossy brochures and receipt printouts. They were for a 14-day, ultra-luxury Caribbean cruise. Spa packages, premium drink tickets, private island excursions. The dates on the receipts matched the exact week Walter was supposedly fighting for his life in a surgical ward. I walked back into the living room, holding the cruise receipts in my shaking hand. I confronted them. I expected tears. I expected apologies or a desperate excuse. Instead, Diane simply looked at me, crossed her arms, and delivered a line that haunts me to this day. "You make so much money in that fancy city, Natalie," she said, her voice dripping with cold resentment. "Why shouldn't your mother have something nice, too? We raised you. We sacrificed our youth for you. You owed us a vacation." I stood there, realizing I had just sold years of my future, years of my labor, to fund her piña coladas. My love was nothing more than a commodity. I left the house that day without saying another word. But I kept paying the debt. The trap was set deep. It took 5 more years of grueling corporate warfare to finally snap the remaining strings. By the time I turned 29, I had clawed my way up the corporate ladder, paid off my student loans, and paid off the miserable personal loan I took out for their fake surgery. I had hoarded my money with aggressive paranoia. But my body was failing. The migraines were daily. The panic attacks were a weekly routine. One rainy Tuesday, while looking at a spreadsheet detailing the bankruptcy of a massive retail chain, my vision simply went black for a few seconds. My body was screaming at me to stop. So, I did. I didn't give a dramatic speech. I didn't throw papers in the air. I calmly drafted a resignation letter, hit send, and walked out of the glass building for the last time. I had been secretly browsing real estate listings for months. I found a place far away from the city, far away from my parents, in the deep, misty mountains of the Pacific Northwest. It was a stunning lake house, surrounded by towering pine trees and ancient cedar woods. The price tag was $520,000. I bought it in cash, using every single cent of my independent labor, draining my fiercely protected savings to zero. It was terrifying, but it was mine. Moving in felt like stepping onto another planet. For the first 3 days, I lived in a sensory sanctuary. Everything smelled like damp earth and rich cedar. The only sound was the wind moving through the pines and the occasional call of a loon across the deep blue water. There were no sirens, no buzzing fluorescent lights, and no demands. I slept on an air mattress in the master bedroom, wrapped in cheap blankets, and I felt like a queen. For the first time in my entire adult life, I could breathe without feeling a crushing pressure on my ribs. I was healing. I was finally, truly safe. Or so I thought. On the morning of the 4th day, the peace was shattered. I was standing on my wooden deck, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the thick morning mist slowly burn off the surface of the lake. It was the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. Then, my phone buzzed on the patio table. It was a single vibration, but it sounded like a gunshot in the still mountain air. I looked down. Diane's name was glaring on the screen. It didn't feel like a mother calling her daughter to congratulate her on buying her first home. It felt like a massive breach of security. I stared at the device until the final ring, my stomach tightening into that familiar, jagged knot I had spent a decade trying to untie. My chest started to restrict. The old Natalie, the conditioned daughter, told me to answer it, to smooth things over, to be good. I swiped the green button and held the phone to my ear. There was no hello. There was no inquiry about my health, or how I was settling into the beautiful new estate I had purchased. The background noise on her end sounded like ripping packing tape and heavy boxes being dragged across hardwood floors. "We are moving in tomorrow," Diane announced. Her tone wasn't a request. It was flat, final, and carried the heavy weight of someone who assumed my entire existence was merely an annex of her own. She spoke with the unearned authority of a general giving orders to a foot soldier. I froze. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. "What?" I managed to whisper, my voice sounding incredibly small. "Your dad said it is fine," she added quickly, using Walter's passive existence as a fake legal seal of approval. I could hear Walter muttering something unintelligible in the background, probably staring at the floor while Diane orchestrated her chaos. For a split second, my mind panicked. My brain tried to find a way to accommodate them. I wondered if I should buy a guest bed, if I should stock the fridge with Walter's favorite beer, if I could handle giving up my weekends to cater to Diane's endless complaints. That was the trauma response kicking in. That was the ghost of the girl who bought a $24,000 gallbladder vacation. But Diane didn't stop there. She never knew when to stop pushing. If she had just asked for the guest room, I might have caved. But Diane was greedy, and her greed was about to be her absolute undoing. "Make sure you sweep the floors before we get there," she continued, her voice echoing sharply through the receiver. "And pack your things from the big bedroom. We are taking the master suite. Your father's back can't handle a small bed." The audacity of that sentence hit me like a physical blow. I was standing on the deck of a $520,000 home that I owned, that I bled for, and the woman who stole my college fund was ordering me out of my own bedroom. I didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched over the phone line. Diane interpreted my silence as weakness. She always did. She let out a harsh, patronizing scoff. "Listen to me, Natalie. We sold our place. We are coming whether you are ready or not. It's ours now. And if you don't like it, you can pack your bags and find somewhere else to live. If you don't like it, you can find somewhere else. In my house." Something deep inside my brain snapped. It wasn't a loud, chaotic break. It was a cold, quiet click. The terrified daughter vanished, instantly replaced by the senior risk analyst. My breathing slowed down. My heart stopped hammering and settled into a steady, icy rhythm. I realized in that exact moment that Diane wasn't a mother asking for help. She was a hostile entity attempting a corporate takeover of my life. My hand stopped shaking. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why she was doing this. I didn't beg for her to understand my need for space and healing. Arguments are for people who still believe a middle ground exists. I knew there was no middle ground here. A strange, electric focus settled over my entire body. I smiled, a tight, cold expression that she couldn't see through the phone. She had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to stop being a victim and start being an executioner. I pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the red button. I hung up on her without saying a single word. The silence of the lake returned, but it was entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of a peaceful retreat. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom right before the judge enters to deliver a life sentence. They wanted to play a game of high-stakes occupancy. Fine. But they were walking into a legal trap, not a family reunion. Thank you for following the story this far. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach a wider audience. Thank you so much. I didn't spend the afternoon pacing the kitchen or crying into my coffee. The old Natalie, the one who viewed her parents as a debt that could never be fully repaid, was gone. She had been replaced by a version of me that viewed this entire situation as a failing corporate merger. My parents were the subsidiary attempting a hostile takeover of the parent company, and I was the litigation analyst hired to shut it down. I decided to implement the gray rock method. It is a psychological technique I had studied during my darkest months at the firm. The goal is to make yourself as uninteresting, as unresponsive, and as cold as a plain gray pebble on the ground. I was choosing to be a non-event, someone who offers no emotional fuel, no matter how hard Diane poked or prodded. For a narcissist like my mother, silence is the ultimate courtroom. Narcissists feed on emotional reactions, whether they are positive or negative. By becoming a gray rock, I was cutting off her oxygen supply. I wasn't going to give her the high of a shouting match or the satisfaction of my tears. I walked to my home office, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. I didn't open a suitcase to pack. I opened my laptop. I pulled up a file I had been quietly maintaining for years, a folder I called the family ledger. This wasn't a breakdown, this was accounting. I had lived in a world where the only schedule was the rising mist over the water for 3 days, but that ended the moment Brenda called. Brenda is my mother's middle name, and in my mind, that's who she became when the mom mask slipped. Everything in my new home still smelled like cedar and damp earth, a sensory sanctuary that was supposed to be far away from the constant buzzing anxiety of the litigation firm. But now, that office energy was exactly what I needed. I sat in the blue light of the laptop screen, feeling a strange electric focus settle over me. I realized that I hadn't been a daughter to Diane and Walter for a long time. I had been a silent investor in their version of a lifestyle they couldn't afford. My compassion had been a luxury they had been overdrafting for over a decade, and tonight, the account was finally hitting zero. I didn't answer the phone when it rang again 10 minutes later. I didn't even look at the screen to see her face. In my old life, I would have been rehearsing a dozen different ways to say no without sounding ungrateful. But that was over. I was preparing a surprise for their arrival, and it wouldn't involve a guest bed. I began to scroll through the history of our relationship, not through old photos, but through digital archives and bank statements. I was ready to audit my own life. The ledger was a brutal read. I had kept receipts in a password-protected drive for 3 years, a habit born from deep-seated mistrust. I started to scroll. It started small. $3,000 for a car repair that never actually seemed to happen. $800 for a utility bill that was supposedly a week away from being shut off. But then the numbers began to swell, blooming like bruises on a page. Over the last 12 years, the total was staggering, $115,000. That was the price of my good daughter status. It was a subscription fee I had paid monthly to keep the peace and to keep the illusion of a family alive. I looked at that number, $115,000, and felt a wave of the sunk cost fallacy try to pull me under. A voice in my head whispered that since I had already given so much, I might as well let them have the guest room. But then I looked out the window at the lake. The mist was thick and gray, hiding the water, but I knew the depths were cold and unforgiving. This wasn't about revenge, it was about an audit. I had been the family's bank for over a decade, and the bank was officially closed for business. Every emergency, every loan, and every gift that was coerced through guilt was documented. I didn't summon regret because there was no room for it. There was only the balance sheet. I was done being a daughter on a subscription plan. Diane viewed me as a high-yield savings account that she had decided to liquidate without notice. She assumed my life was merely an annex of her own. She believed she could stage a hostile takeover of my home. She had even told me to find somewhere else to live in the house I owned with my own independent labor. The audacity of that sentence was the final piece of evidence I needed to stop being a daughter and start being a landlord. I began to draft a formal itemization of every dollar I had ever sent them. I used the same clinical, detached language I had used for years in high-stakes litigation. This wasn't an emotional plea for them to recognize my sacrifice. It was an accounting of the debt they had already accrued. It was proof that the subscription of my loyalty had been paid in full and the bill was now past due. I wanted them to see that number, $115,000, in black and white. By the time the moon was high over the pines, the trembling in my fingers had stopped. I wasn't just checking the ledger anymore, I was digging into the foundation of my own credit. The purchase of the Lakehouse had required a deep dive into my financial history, and while the bank had cleared me, something in the fine print had been nagging at the back of my litigation-trained brain. I opened my full credit report, the long clinical list of every debt and inquiry attached to my name for the last decade. And there it was, a line item tucked away in a submenu of closed accounts. It was a home equity line of credit, also known as a HELOC. The amount was $40,000. My heart didn't race, it went cold, like the water at the bottom of the lake. I looked at the date the account was opened, June 12, 2024. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. I remembered June of 2024 perfectly. I had spent that entire month in London. I was working on a cross-border merger that required me to be in a secure office in Canary Wharf from 8 in the morning until midnight every single day. I hadn't even been in the country, let alone at a notary's office in my hometown. I pulled up my old travel records and bank statements from that month. There were no flights home, only charges for London Underground fares and overpriced coffee in the British capital. Then I looked at the digital copy of the HELOC application. There it was, my signature, or rather, a practiced, shaky imitation of it. It listed me as a co-guarantor for $40,000. They hadn't just overdrafted my kindness, they had committed identity theft. My mother had kept a digital folder of my sensitive documents, my social security card and previous tax filings from the years I spent managing their finances. They had bypassed the bank's physical verification by using an online portal and a local notary who was a longtime family friend, someone who didn't ask questions when Diane claimed I was away on business but had signed the papers in advance. They had turned my childhood loyalty into a digital weapon. They had forged my name to borrow money they knew they could never pay back, using my perfect credit score as their personal collateral. This wasn't a family emergency or a misunderstanding, this was a felony. Suddenly, their rush to move into my home made sense. They weren't just looking for a guest room, they were running from the wreckage of the financial house of cards they had built using my name as the foundation. They had sold their house to cover other debts, but this $40,000 was still out there, hanging over my head like a guillotine. I rubbed my eyes, but I didn't feel tired anymore. I felt like I was back in the courtroom, looking at a defendant who had just been caught in a blatant lie. This was the kill shot. I didn't call the police yet. I simply downloaded the document and saved it into a folder labeled Evidence, The Arrival. The betrayal wasn't a sudden storm, it was a slow rot that I had finally decided to expose to the light. At 6 in the morning, the silence of the Lakehouse was broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my phone on the nightstand. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. Diane didn't understand time zones or boundaries, she only understood her own needs. I picked up the device and saw a photo. It was a grainy shot of a bright yellow moving truck parked in a driveway I recognized all too well. The caption read, "All loaded up. We should be there by noon. Make sure there is space in the driveway for the ramp." I stared at the image of the massive yellow truck, wondering which credit card they had maxed out to pay for it. They were spending their remaining crumbs on a gamble, betting that I would be too weak to turn them away once they were parked on my gravel. I didn't jump out of bed. I didn't feel the frantic need to call her and scream. I simply sat up, the cold mountain air raising goosebumps on my arms, and watched the messages start to pour in like a sequence of scripted attacks. Diane was shifting into her primary mode of combat, the sacrificial mother card. "I cannot believe you are being so difficult about this," the next text read. "After everything your father and I have done for you. I carried you for 9 months. I spent 20 years making sure you had every advantage. We sacrificed our youth so you could have that fancy degree and that big city job. And now when we are in a bind, you want to treat us like strangers. It is heartbreaking, Natalie. Truly heartbreaking." I stared at the words 9 months. In my previous life, those words would have been a leash pulling me back into a state of guilty compliance. But looking at it through the lens of a litigation analyst, I saw a faulty contract. A 9-month biological lease does not grant a lifetime of squatter's rights over an adult daughter's sanity or her property. My mother didn't view me as a person, she viewed me as a resource to be harvested. I remained a gray rock. I didn't reply to a single message. I didn't give them the fuel of an argument. Arguments are for people who still think there is a middle ground to be found. I was becoming a non-event. Then came the reinforcement. Walter finally broke his silence, though it was clearly dictated by Diane. "Natalie, be a big person here," his text read. "Your mother is under a lot of stress. We already gave notice on our place and the new tenants are moving in tomorrow. We literally have nowhere else to go. Do not break your mother's heart over a guest room. We are family. Family helps each other." The manipulation was perfect. It was a pincer movement of guilt and urgency designed to make me feel like a monster if I didn't surrender my keys. They had intentionally burned their own bridges to make sure I was forced to build them a new one. It was a calculated move to trap me in a corner where my only choices were compliant daughter or family villain. I stood by the window and watched the mist roll off the lake, feeling a strange, detached curiosity. I wondered if they realized that in all those texts, in all that emotional grandstanding, not once had they asked if I was okay. Not once had they asked why I had quit my job or if I was happy. They weren't coming to see me, they were coming to occupy a resource. The realization didn't hurt, it simplified everything. They were running from the wreckage of the financial house of cards they had built. They had sold their house to cover other debts, but they knew that $40,000 forged loan was still out there. Their rush to move into my home was a flight from justice. They believed that authority traveled with them, that they could just walk into my life and take over. They were betting that I would be too weak to confront the felony they had committed against me. I went into the kitchen, brewed a pot of black coffee, and sat back down at my laptop. If they wanted to play a game of high-stakes occupancy, fine. But they were walking into a courtroom, not a family reunion. I wasn't reacting to their chaos, I was defining the parameters of their existence in my world. I opened a fresh document on my laptop. I wasn't writing a letter to my mother, I was drafting a formal short-term rental agreement. I used the same clinical, detached language I had used for years in litigation. I listed the terms with lethal precision. Monthly rent, $3,500. This was the exact market rate for a luxury lakefront property in this county. Security deposit, $7,000, due in full upon entry. I added clauses about quiet hours starting at 9 in the evening, a strictly enforced no-smoking policy, and a provision that any permanent alterations to the property would result in immediate eviction. Then I attached the family ledger spreadsheet as an addendum. I titled it Statement of Outstanding Family Contributions, 2014 to 2026. I wanted them to see the number, $115,000, in black and white. It was an accounting of the debt they had already accrued and proof that the bill was now past due. But the most important document was in the second folder I prepared. It was a copy of the HELOC application from June of 2024. $40,000 with a signature that looked remarkably like mine, despite the fact that I was 3,000 miles away in London on the day it was supposedly notarized. I included my travel records and the forensic evidence to prove I wasn't there. I also drafted a formal complaint to the Secretary of State to have the notary's commission revoked, along with a civil suit for professional negligence. I was dismantling the entire network Diane used to betray me, starting with anyone who dared to put a legal seal on her lies. I didn't send a text back, and I didn't return Walter's call. Instead, I sent a formal email to their shared account. The subject line was Terms and Conditions for Potential Occupancy. I kept the body of the email to a single cold sentence. Attached are the legal and financial requirements for your stay at this private residence. Please review and have all documents notarized before arrival. I hit send. I felt a strange sense of power. For the first time in 29 years, the ground under my feet was mine. My laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I took a sip of my black coffee and looked out at the water. The mist was starting to burn off, revealing the cold, deep blue beneath. I was ready. The sound of tires on gravel announced their arrival exactly at noon. I watched from the living room window as the black SUV rolled into my driveway, with the massive yellow moving truck I had seen in the photo lumbering close behind it. It looked like a predatory shadow following its scout. Both vehicles stopped with the unearned confidence of an invading army. Diane stepped out first. Her eyes immediately began scanning the cedar siding and the expansive deck with a look of predatory satisfaction. She wasn't looking at my home as a place of healing, she was surveying her new kingdom. Walter followed, his shoulders hunched, carrying that same absent expression he had worn my entire life, the face of a man who watched his wife set fires and simply handed her the matches. They didn't knock. Diane pushed the front door open and marched into the entryway as if she were crossing a finish line. She didn't look at me, she looked at the dust on the baseboards. "Natalie, you really should have swept before we got here," she called out, her voice echoing through the high ceilings. Criticism arrived before affection, as it always did. Walter stood behind her, a silent shadow in the doorway. I stood firmly in the center of the entryway, physically blocking the path to the rest of the house. I had seen enough legal cases to know that once they moved their boxes past this threshold and slept a single night, they could claim residency. I wasn't going to let a single suitcase touch my floor until the terms were signed and the trap was set. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer a hug or a glass of water. I simply stood by the dining room table where 3 thick white folders were resting in a neat row. "I prepared something for you," I said. My voice was level, almost detached. Diane paused, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "Oh, please, Natalie, don't start with the drama," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "We have been driving for hours. We just want to get settled into our room." "Which one is ours? The one with the lake view?" I didn't answer. I gestured toward the table. I opened the first folder and slid it toward her. "This is the itemized audit of the last 12 years, I told her. $115,000. Every rent payment I covered, every medical bill I paid, every luxury you demanded under the guise of an emergency." Diane's face tightened. "Are you seriously trying to bill your parents?" she demanded, her voice rising into that familiar register of outraged entitlement. Walter shifted uncomfortably, looking at the floor. I didn't let her finish. I opened the second folder. "This is a copy of the HELOC application from June of 2024, I said. $40,000. It features a signature that looks remarkably like mine, despite the fact that I was 3,000 miles away in London on the day it was notarized." The color drained from Diane's face so fast it was almost cinematic. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I looked her directly in the eye. "That is a felony, Mother. It is identity theft and bank fraud. I have the travel records and the forensic evidence to prove I wasn't there," I continued. "And don't think your family friend at the notary office is safe either. I've already drafted a formal complaint to the Secretary of State to have their commission revoked, along with a civil suit for professional negligence. I am dismantling the entire network you used to betray me," I said, my voice as cold as the lake. "Starting with anyone who dared to put a legal seal on your lies." I opened the third folder. "This is a short-term rental agreement," I said. "If you stay as tenants. You will pay $3,500 a month. You will sign this agreement, which includes a clause that you will repay the $40,000 you stole within 24 months, or I will hand this second folder to the district attorney." The explosion I expected finally came. Diane screamed that I was ungrateful, that I was a monster, and that family doesn't do this to each other. But for the first time in my life, her words had nowhere to land. I was a gray rock. I was a courtroom. I was the law in my own home. Walter finally spoke, his voice strained. "Natalie, this is extreme." "No," I replied quietly. "What was extreme was assuming you could take my life whenever it suited you. You believed authority traveled with you. It doesn't. It stayed at the gate. You can sign the agreement and pay your way, or you can get back in that SUV and find somewhere else. The choice is entirely yours, and for once, you have no power over the outcome." Diane looked around the room, and for the first time, she saw it for what it was, a fortress she couldn't breach. She looked smaller, suddenly older. They didn't sign, they couldn't afford to. Without another word, Diane turned and walked out the door, her heels clicking sharply on the wood. Walter followed her, a silent reinforcement until the very end. I stood on the deck and watched them drive away, the ocean of green pines swallowing the SUV and the yellow truck. The fear that had defined my life dissolved into a cold, beautiful certainty. I was finally alone, and for the first time I was safe. The sound of their engine faded into the distance until there was nothing left but the wind and the pines. I stayed on the deck for a long time, watching the sun dip toward the mountains. The lake was a deep, unbothered blue, echoing the stillness that had finally returned to my home. In the movies, this moment would have been loud, a triumphant musical score or a dramatic collapse into tears. But my victory was silent. It was the sound of a heavy door finally locking into place. It was the feeling of a debt being settled, not with money, but with truth. I went back inside and looked at the 3 white folders sitting on the table. They looked like ordinary office supplies, but they were the blueprints of my liberation. I picked them up and put them in a drawer. I didn't need to look at the numbers anymore, $115,000 of documented support and $40,000 of forged debt. Those figures no longer defined my worth, they defined the distance I had traveled to save myself. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and realized that for the first time in 29 years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for a phone call. I was just living. Over the next few weeks, the silence of the Lakehouse became my best friend. I didn't hear from Diane or Walter again. When you show a predator the cage you built for them, they rarely come back to test the bars. I had escaped the crushing pressure in my ribs, and in its place, I found a steady, quiet strength. Forgiveness is a beautiful thing, but it isn't a requirement for your healing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to be cold and clinical. I didn't get an apology, and I didn't get my $40,000 back, but I got my future. I learned that no is a complete sentence and that boundaries aren't meant to punish others, they are meant to protect the version of you that finally learned how to breathe. I haven't heard from them since that day, and I intend to keep it that way. But some extended family members, who don't know the full extent of the fraud, are calling me ruthless. They say I should have just let them stay since it's a big house. So tell me, am I the asshole for treating my parents like criminals and evicting them before they even unpacked? Thank you for watching this story to the very end. If you enjoyed this journey of reclamation and justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more daily stories. Your support helps me keep sharing these stories of boundaries and strength. What would you have done if you were in Natalie's shoes? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.